Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Amy Witherden. With me in the studio I have Lyle, Cupido and Cezanne Samuel of the South African Institute of International Affairs to discuss South Africa's new law on cellular identification registration in terms of the regulation of interception of communications and provision of Communications-Related Information Act. Lyle, can you outline for us the legal and practical implications of this new legislation?
Okay, well, effectively, the new legislation, or the Amendment Act, as we'll call it, it does three things. First, it amends and expands on definitions in the previous Act, the 2002 Act. It then also provides for the information that a service provider must now take from a customer. And then it also sets out the penalties and offences for those people that do not comply with the new legislation. In practical terms, this means that a service provider cannot activate a SIM card without first accepting the personal information of a customer. And by personal information, it's meant the identity number, the full name and surname of the person, and at least one postal address of the person. For existing customers, the service provider has a period of 18 months within which to obtain their personal information. And if that information is not obtained within 18 months, the SIM card is deactivated. That information that the service provider then obtains has to be secured in a database for a period of 3 years. That's the minimum period. And it will only be accessible to selected personnel. So in effect, that's what the new legislation means.
Okay, and what is the purpose of this legislation?
Well, the purpose, according to government, they've come out and said that it's intended to combat crime. The idea being that because cell phones are being used increasingly by criminals in organized crime or in criminal activity, and the prepaid SIM card allows you the luxury of anonymity, they want to use this new law to combat crime by linking the person involved in criminal activity to a particular SIM card, and then you can trace their name, their place where they live, and their identity number. So you'd have all that information.
Okay. Cezanne, do you think these measures will be effective in fighting crime?
Well, I think it will be a very interesting thing to look at, but you have to look at the practicalities of the legislation. I mean, there are so many loopholes in the justice system that criminals are adept at working through already, and you have to look at what other legislation that was aimed at combating crime, such as our gun laws, and how it has actually caused more of a problem for our overburdened police instead of really combating crime. And you find that law-abiding citizens have ended up losing their guns on arbitrary grounds. So you have to look at that. And there are also the practical considerations. If a SIM card is lost, will it still be traced back to its owner even though they haven't used it? These are considerations that many countries have looked at. You wonder how far it will actually take the struggle against crime.
Okay. And if I can just say something, if I may, it also doesn't apply to someone that comes from overseas who's registered with a service provider overseas and comes into South Africa and continues to use the SIM card that's registered overseas. I think you use it in instances of roaming. So that's something that's largely undermined fighting crime in other countries because it can exclude a large portion of SIM cards that are not registered in South Africa.
So there are a lot of loopholes in that.
Definitely.
There are loopholes.
Also,
well.
I mean, the police must realize that there has to be extensive investigatory work done prior to actually wanting this information. So, how far the actual SIM card legislation in itself combat crime, well, that is certainly questionable.
Okay. And Cezanne, how do South Africa's regulations of cellular identification registration compare with international practice in this regard?
Sure. Well, it's actually quite a common international trend. It's implemented recently. A lot of African countries have begun to implement it, and many European and Asian countries have already tried to implement it. Some have realized that it doesn't work. Some still carry it on. But, for example, in Thailand, in 2004, it was made mandatory for everyone to register their SIM card. But that was more aimed at addressing the issue of violence that was occurring in the south of Thailand at the time. However, in 2005, the Information Communication and Technology Minister openly admitted that it's done really little to combat that violence, and in fact today you don't need to register your SIM card in Thailand when you buy it. And in Germany it was done away with in 2004, but that was more of an industry and privacy concern. That was the problem, but it was proposed for to the New Zealand government in 2006, and they didn't even pass the legislation because they realized that the problem that they actually happened in Thailand would be the same problem which Lyle mentioned of international SIM cards being used, which would effectively undermine the whole system.
Okay. So do you think South Africa is becoming a surveillance state then, Big Brother style?
That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think there definitely are. There's a cause for some concern. For example, the period that you have to retain the information, it's 3 years. It's quite excessive. In most other countries, it's about 3 months, and 9 months is the maximum, or they don't have a retention period at all. So for me, that's quite, it's a looming threat to privacy that your information is going to be retained for a period of 3 years. And also, the service provider is obliged to hand over that information if the police come and they say, if they request that information. So I think there definitely are reasons for people to be a bit worried, but I don't want to scare people.
I think yes, the concern is not so much maybe this will help fight crime, maybe it won't, but what are the implications that it will have on our privacy? And what will it mean politically? I mean, how will this affect the opposition party? Could they be posing a security threat? It's a very vague issue that could be exploited.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much.
That was Lyle Cupido and Cezanne Samuel speaking on the regulation of interception of communications and provision of Communication-Related Information Act.